I'm Alicia Wittmeyer. I'm the gender editor of the opinion section of the New York Times. And so we're here talking today about women as drivers of stability, peace, and security. So there is probably no domain of governance that's more traditionally thought of as the domain of men than national security. So whether it's soldiers, peacekeepers on the front lines, or the general and the civilian leadership who are making strategic choices, this has been one of the areas of government that has been trickiest for women to break into and accumulate influence and make an impact. But even this bastion of manly men hasn't been immune from the forces of 2018. And over the last few years, we've not only seen changes when it comes to women serving on the front lines in combat roles, we've seen women appointed to important leadership positions in foreign affairs and security in countries across the globe. That includes some of Europe's biggest countries, Spain, Germany, Italy, and France, but also Kenya, CAR, and up until recently, Japan. So we have the tremendous privilege of having with us today Florence Minister for the Armed Forces of France, who's going to speak with us briefly about how and whether women serve as special drivers of stability, peace, and security. And then Minister Parly needs to leave, but happily we're going to be joined by some delegates from Girls 20, a program that seeks to place young women at the center of global decision-making processes, and by Baroness Mary Gowdy, a member of the UK House of Lords, who's been deeply involved in questions of women, peace, and security for years. So with that, let's kick it off. So Minister Parly, you've worked at the highest levels of national security and have been at the table when high-stakes decisions are being made on issues like funding, future planning, deployments. So can you tell us, when you're having those conversations, do you notice gender dynamics playing a role at all? And if so, can you give us a sense of what that looks like?
Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. I would like to share something that any women here in front of me probably will agree with. And this thing is that a woman has to make twice her point to be heard. And it has been true in the past, and it is still true in the present. So, but in my position of Minister of the Armed Forces, I must say that I'm considered, and probably a woman general is considered as an equal. So there is respect and there is equality. So the question is more about how we can get more women in our armed forces than the way those women are treated and considered at the highest level. So today, the French army is the fourth one in terms of number of or proportion of women compared to the overall staff. This is not a bad ranking. The first one is, of course, Israel. The United States are in the third position. And we have to fight in order to get more women in a position of power and of influence.
And can I just interrupt you and ask, what is that proportion?
It's 14%, so it's very low. If you consider it in absolute terms, it's 14%. There are places where they are more numerous, and I can give you two examples. The first one is about the Army Health Service. So I appointed last year the head of this Army Health Service, and it's a lady. And there are many doctors who are female in the Army Health Service, so that's an example. But I would like to give another one. Last summer, for the very first time, we have 4 women who took part as officers in 90 days nuclear submarine patrol. It was the really first time we could do that. And the reason why we had to wait so long is that the submarines are very small boats, and we had to redesign the rooms in order those women can have their own room without being mingled for comfort reasons with men. So that's an achievement, but 14% is of course not satisfactory. So I want, and this is my commitment, to get that higher. And I'm really convinced that the gender diversity is a gift. This is an opportunity. And as a woman and as a minister, I feel even more committed to it because, of course, probably a man would not feel this goal as something as important as it is to me.
So that's actually a great segue into the next thing I was going to ask, which is how do you think about these questions of diversity, gender and otherwise, and national security? So when you're making staffing decisions, and what I mean by that is what do you see as the outcome that you're trying to achieve when you're saying that we want to increase the number of women in the armed forces?
Well, I don't see any difference between a man and a woman who has to take a difficult decision, putting at stake the lives of their men and women who fight in an army. So, to me, it is absolutely the same. And wherever you are, if you attend a board meeting or if you serve as a minister for the armed forces, you may have difficult decisions to make, and I don't see any difference. But I think it's extremely important for our young girls to be able to see and to recognize somewhere that women are able to make such decisions. Women are able to have such positions. So it's a kind of recognition that our government appointed women in very sovereign responsibilities. Justice, army, our ministers are women in their position. And it's very new. And we are, of course, a very equal government, very balanced between men and women. So I think that we have to fight to get this number of women higher. And when, for instance, again, another example, when I discuss with my counterpart of the finance minister, who is a man, about the way to increase the defense budget, there is no difference. It's not because I'm a lady that it makes a difference in the money I can get from him. So we were very successful. There is a new military programming law which was adopted a few months ago, which is the first since the end of the Cold War, which provides to the ministry additional budget. It is very significant. This year we got 1.8 billion more compared to the previous year, and it will continue in the next 7 years. So I'm sure that I would have been a man, there would have been any difference. And it's not because I am a lady that the finance ministers give me more or less money. So it is the same. So I think that if as a woman I can draw the attention of people like you, journalists, or the opinion more generally, that women are really able to have this kind of responsibility and to act exactly with the same sense of duty, the same sense of responsibility than a man, I think this is really something which can help, because we need to have examples, we need to have symbols. And of course, when a lady like Michelle Obama writes a book sharing her experience as a lady, as a woman, who could have been at the prime level and who accepted to be the first lady, meaning that she was not herself the president. It's a very, very interesting lesson because she says, I would have been able, but that was not my choice. And now I want to come back to my own life. And I really think this is a lesson.
There's so many interesting things to follow up on there, but we have so little time,
I'm sorry,
that's
because
okay. I think we'll move on a little bit. So, of course, when we're talking about women in peace and security, we're not just talking about the women who are soldiers and generals and defense ministers. We're also talking about the women who are experiencing the realities of war in actual theater. So I wanted to, we got a great question from one of the delegates from Girls 20 that I wanted to make sure we got to ask you today, which is how does the French military think about strategies to protect women and girls in places where they are deployed? That is to say, where the military is deployed, the women and girls who are local to the area, in areas, and how are local women consulted when those strategies are being designed?
Well, of course, the most important thing is not to win the war. The most important thing is to win the peace. And when there is a war somewhere, we all acknowledge that civilians are the first to be targeted. And among civilians, women and children are the weakest, and so they suffered even more from the others, compared to the others. So protecting civilians is really something that we have to take care. And we know on top of that, and you told me that there was a very interesting conference before about the way women are used as a weapon. They are raped, and they are raped on purpose as an arm or a weapon. So this is not acceptable. So, of course, we comply with all the United Nations resolutions, which are extremely clear about that. The resolution 1325, which has been adopted in 2000, so it's 18 years from now, and stressed the importance of the full and equal participation of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, as well as the building and persistence of women's rights. So since then, it has been followed by a number of resolutions, and all the peacekeeping operations led by the United Nations include in their action specific actions dedicated to women. And on top of that, I can add that I mentioned the Army Health Service. And of course, when we are deployed somewhere in the Sahel, in Levant, we have doctors to take care of our soldiers, but not only our own forces, but also of the population who are there. And I visited one hospital 2 days ago in Mali, and part of the activity of the service is really dedicated to the population and to the education of the population about health, how to take care of children, how to take care of women as well. So we feel this is at the core of our commitment to take care of the population, and with a specific commitment regarding women and children.
That's endless follow-up chances. But before we have to let you go, I wanted to ask you if you thought that there were any particularly widespread or common misconceptions about women and peace and national security that you've run into during your time.
Well, of course there are misconceptions, but to me, what really counts is to continue the fight, quote unquote, that many women started years ago in order to get equality between men and women. So my main message, and that was the same I delivered here a year ago, was when we don't move forward as women, we move backwards. So because there are misconceptions, we have to go forward even more, I would say. And again, we need models. Education is key. Education of our girls, education of our boys. So we have to show our daughters that everything is accessible to them, everything, and the example of the submarine patrols is a very good one. And we have also to show our boys how to respect everybody. Everybody, meaning women as well as men. And so my conclusion is that equality is a fight, but when I use this word fight, I don't use it as a Minister of Armed Forces. I use it in the way that women have to fight, otherwise they will move backwards. But this fight is targeted to get equality and harmony. So it's not a war. Fight doesn't mean a war between men and women.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Pali, for being here with us. You've certainly given us a lot of fodder for our subsequent conversation, but we're going to have to let her go. She has a very busy schedule. So can we get another round of applause for the Minister? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
And so now we're going to be joined on stage by some of the delegates from Girls 20 and by the Baroness Mary Gowdy. So we have with us today Amelia Hannion, Sarah Tannen, Priyanka Roychoudhury, and Baroness Mary Gowdy, where we can continue this conversation. Do you guys need a minute? Do you guys need a minute to get set up? Are you fine on headsets and stuff? So I guess the place that we were going to get started, even though she's still here, and so maybe she'll get a chance to hear us. But I was going, for those of you who don't know, the original idea was that the delegates would get a chance to ask Minister Pali some questions. And so instead we're going to just chat a little bit about what questions you guys would have wanted to ask, what you would have liked to have seen covered, and why. So Amelia, do you want to get started first?
Yeah, it's great. I'm actually really lucky because you asked a question that would have been the question I was going to ask. So I'm cheating slightly. The question was about the strategies that need to be put in place to protect girls and women in conflict. And the reason I thought that question was so important was that, as Minister Pali said, women do suffer disproportionately in war. They suffer in a number of ways. They suffer because they lose the protection of the traditional protection of male relatives. They lose which assures them safety. They lose resources. They lose the person who often provides for them. And so without having had necessarily training, without necessarily having skills, without resources, they have to provide for their families.
And as the minister mentioned, they are often deliberately targeted. That's a very common thing to happen. So did anything surprise you about the answer? I, for one, did not. I was interested to hear about the education efforts that take place, and that surprised me. I'd be curious to just find out more about what that looks like. But were you surprised by anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I learned something for sure because I didn't realize that the French military considers education and health as part of their role. That's something that, in my mind, I would have imagined would be taken on by someone else. I think it's great because it means that they act holistically when they intervene somewhere.
So Sarah, do you want to, same question for you. So what would you have asked if you had gotten a chance?
Yeah. So my question would have been, how can
speak a little bit more into the mic?
Yeah. So how can the inclusion of women having a minority background, be it ethnically, be it religiously or sexually, an added value in the process of development of stability, security, and the society itself? I really think that it's important nowadays in the world we live today to include women having a minority background, women that have different values, and also to bring to the table different voices. We cannot continue to not consider these women, but in general people who have a different background than ours. And I really believe it's another value to bring to the decision-making table different voices nowadays. Yeah.
So Priyanka, we'll ask you the same question.
Yes, so my question was very much around the topic that you discussed with Minister Pali, and that was about how women in such strong leadership positions such as defense, foreign affairs, which are traditionally looked at to be with masculine characteristics. So my question particularly was how she, in her role in such a leadership position, was redefining that position in a way which showcases that there have been stereotypes associated with it in the past. The reason I wanted to hear her experience and her learnings from it was because I feel that in our process, in our discussions of breaking stereotypes, we also sometimes end up making new stereotypes. And I think that is particularly something which might be disadvantageous for someone who's looking at these positions as a role model. For an example, if I say if a woman goes up to such a position as a minister of the armed forces, they might be expected to put up a strong front where you go for wars, you make your position known. But if someone goes for peace, it shouldn't be seen as a weakness and associated to be as a woman.
Yeah, the one aspect of that part of the conversation that I found quite interesting and would have loved to follow it up on more is that the minister seemed to be presenting women in defense leadership and women in the armed forces that they as more or less the same as men and equals to men, and that their purpose should be as role models. So to open up a sphere for young, in part, it's interesting because I think there are a lot of people who have the perspective I don't want to be excessively essentialist here, but people who feel that women sometimes can behave differently in those roles or have different perspectives that they bring that changes how those roles operate. And so it was interesting to me that she didn't seem to have that sense. And so I wish we could have talked more about it, but what can you do? So Mary, why don't you tell us what you would have asked her had you gotten the chance?
I think I would have supported her
A little bit.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. Sounds better. I think I would have supported her on the question of having women in every level of the military, as we've had a history in the United Kingdom and in other parts of the world where women are on the same par as men. Also, I would have asked her a bit more about the peacekeeping education that Britain and other countries are doing around the world, especially with the world's military, understanding that men and women are not tools of war, because it's not just women. Men are also becoming tools of war. And the education on the military and on the United Nations peacekeepers is absolutely vital.
What do you mean by men are also becoming tools of war?
men are being raped as well,
Oh, I
and
see.
young boys. And that has terrible effects. And the British House of Lords did an inquiry into sexual violence and conflict, and some of the evidence that we had from psychologists and from people themselves was quite devastating. For women, it's terrible, but I was never had understood how bad it was for men, and that really woke you up even more so on the issue.
So you've been involved in questions of women and security and peacekeeping for a long time and been very interested in these questions. So I'm curious for your own perspective on whether you think that women have a different perspective, whether the perspective that women bring to these roles changes how they behave in the roles. I think that is a sort of interesting question around this topic, and I don't think it has an obvious answer.
Is this around the military?
Around the military, it's around women in defense, generally speaking, women who are actually acting as peacekeepers. You know, does the fact that they're women matter?
No, they lead by example. They lead. We're equal to men, so we can do the job equally. I don't think there's any difference whether it's a man or a woman. And if you look at women taking very senior roles in the military, they have carried those off extremely well and even better. You know, so I don't think there is any difference at all.
And what about you guys? Have you considered this question, or have you thought about whether it makes a difference that when women are in these particular roles? I wish I could be more prepared to cite research off the top of my head, and I'm not here, unfortunately. But I would say that it's a contested question. So people do study, whether women in peacekeeping roles or in sort of defense leadership act differently, and that's not to say better or worse, but just differently. Whether they approach the task at hand differently, whether there's sort of a these are spaces that are traditionally very masculine with a lot that comes along with it. I'm just sort of seeking to get various perspectives on this. So I don't know if you guys have a sense of or have given any thought to this question.
We would be having this conversation just before with Baroness Goody,
Interesting.
and we were talking about different countries, different case studies, and so we're talking about, for example, the example of Rwanda, where women were involved in the peacekeeping process, where women I think have around a 30% representation in government. And that's a country where I think 30 to 50% of women were raped during the genocide.
Right.
And the fact that women were part of the peacekeeping process and are still part of keeping that peace means that women are taken on board for building the future of the country.
Absolutely, and that is part and parcel of this question, but also a very sort of separate and important part of it unto itself, which is that peacekeeping, sort of official peacekeeping, has had a lot of issues with sexual violence associated with it, and so it's the question of what role women play when they take on those roles and how that changes the dynamics is a very interesting one. So did you guys have any aspects of the conversation that you would have followed up on if you were on stage? If you were me and you had the chance, would you have followed up on anything?
I think
and anyone feel free to jump in.
I think particularly I would have you posed a question which I wanted to maybe take it forward with about the sexual violence that not only is prevalent, very prevalent in the regions of conflict on the citizens or the civilians, but within the armed forces as well, in which Baroness did point out that within the armies, within the armed forces, there are a lot of cases which come out in bits and pieces to the general public about sexual violence, which needs to be addressed very pertinently, and especially so in the wake of the Me Too movement. I think the Me Too movement has gotten the ball rolling about speaking out and talking out about it. But given the sensitivity associated with topics such as security, national defense, I think it is all the more important to understand that there should be a safe space, a safe platform for people within these forces to talk about what they might be facing.
Did anyone else have anything else they were going to follow up on? One thing that was really interesting, the submarine discussion was quite interesting to me, and the fact that they actually engaged in redesigning submarines. I think it was a couple of years ago, but in the States there was a lot of discussion about women serving on submarines, in part because of the closeness of the quarters, and whether that would lead to any. That's a very fraught subject, but the argument went that submarines are really tiny quarters. We can't have men and women together in these tiny quarters, so women can't be on submarines, which is often always the outcome when you have these questions. So did anyone else have anything else that they would have liked to follow up on? Baroness, I know that you had a lot of things you wanted to ask her about, so I'm trying to prompt you to criticize my interviewing a little bit.
No, not criticizing at all. It's important that my colleagues here have the space, because they're the generations that will take over from us and fight for these issues. But I think the question I would have asked the Minister, as which we've managed to get a very firm line in Britain, is that no peace talks without women at the peace table. And in Syria and in other talks that are going on just now, and hopefully if we get some peace talks going in Yemen, that there must be no talks without local women at the table. Because if women aren't at the table, the peace doesn't it doesn't last. The infrastructure for the country just doesn't come in at all. And we must not have any talks without local women and other women at the peace table. And Britain has signed up to that. I think France has signed up to that. But we have to continue to say that. Otherwise, there is no peace at all. And that is part of the UN regulations that the Minister talked about.
So let's probe a little bit more into that, because I know that what's interesting. So we kind of know we have these various indices that say, okay, if we have if women. They sort of put women's equality on one side and sort of stability of the country on another side, and say the more equal the women, the more stable the country. But when we say sort of women at the table, women at peace talks, and without them they don't last. Can you sort of talk a little bit more about the mechanisms of how that works exactly? So we more or less know that is the case, but what is actually happening? When women are brought to the table, what are they able to bring to that table that sort of ensures this kind of stability?
Well, if you remember, women, and we all know this, bear the brunt of war before it starts, during the period of the war, and it is women at the end of the day who say enough's enough, because they cannot cope with what's happening. Their families being killed, picking up no food, no education, etc. If you have local women at the table, they know what their country needs for peace to stay. You've got to have infrastructure, you've got to have health brought in, you've got to have education, including the opportunities for higher education, even if it means young people leaving the country and coming back. You have to have infrastructure for funding from outside governments so that you can get businesses up and running, because it's no use just saying, okay, no war, and there's no food, there's no education, there's no health, no future opportunities, and no housing. And the schools and buildings like that are then used for offices instead of the officers and others being in tents. They use the schools because they're the most secure buildings in any establishment, normally. So women at the peace table know what's needed. And where women are at the peace table, the peace continues. Because they forgive, but they don't forgive easily. And they can't be rushed. I mean, some of the people who come in to do the peace from various countries want it over before they've come in, because they want to rush off to something. So it's really important that there's no peace without women.
So
no women without peace.
We've got a couple of minutes left, so we're going to try to close this session as we've closed all the others, which is with a call to action. So if you don't mind sort of kicking us off, so what would you tell people leaving here today about women and peace, stability, and security?
Well, no women, no peace, basically.
For me, given that I have been given this space as a young participant, I think it is important for us that we as the youth want to make it heard that we want peace. That's what we aim for. And for this, I see the onus to be on the governments, the world leaders across the world, to take this up as a priority and make legal structures and policies in their countries to make sure that there is peace where women are on the table, because everyone's voices need to be heard. And given that we know that women are disproportionately affected, there cannot be resolutions without having heard all the voices.
So, as I said before, as you can see, I am a Muslim woman. I was born in Italy. I'm a first-generation Italian. And still, there is a lot of things to do, like in terms of progress when it comes to including different women. And I really believe that today we need to include women having a different background, that I said before, because I think that it can help us develop a more inclusive, a more also cohesive society. And we cannot have a more inclusive society, like a more stable society, if it's not more inclusive. So my call to action is making sure that people being in the establishment include women with different backgrounds, so that we can also not just having them in the decision-making table, but also having them as a role models in the army, so that girls and women can have someone to look up to and to be inspired with.
My answer to that question would be, I think that we need to ask women and girls in areas of conflict. We need to hear their voices. We need to ask them what they need, how we can protect them. War is horrible, and there will always be suffering. But we need some kind of commission on the things on their voices, the needs that they have. To keep them safe.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much, and thank you guys so much for listening.